Hello. Being that this is a language class, I decided to submit this in a video format so you can hear me speaking and we can talk a little bit about what these questions mean to me. So the first question that is listed is, what language practices are most closely associated with your childhood and how did they contribute to your upbringing? So this was something that I just found out my whole life. My mom always told me, like, oh, you spoke English first. And I was like, why was it difficult sometimes, in class? Why was I always placed with someone to help me, like, in class? And it didn't make sense. I just thought that I was a little bit slower at comprehending, and so that just kind of took a big toll on me in elementary specifically. I remember thinking that to myself in 5th grade, that I felt slower than everyone else because I wasn't at the same level as them. And it wasn't until 2-ish weeks ago where I had a conversation with my mom and I asked her, now that I've graduated high school and there's no like fear of being placed in ELD, what was my first language? And she said, well, both English and Spanish. And I said, what do you mean both? And she said, well, we spoke Spanish to you your first entire 2 years, and so you learned Spanish. But at the time, she worked at a preschool, Christian private preschool. It's not important, but I would go with her because she didn't have a babysitter. So since I was 2 years old, I was exposed to English. So it was English at school, at that preschool, and then at home it was 100% Spanish. And so I told her, I was 2 years old and I was learning both of these languages simultaneously. And she said yes. Her English isn't the best. She can speak, write, and read it, but she only spoke to me in Spanish at home. And she said that at that like ripe age of 2-3 years old, I was able to understand English and Spanish and speak English and Spanish, and I was able to identify when someone was speaking to me in English, I would respond in English. If someone was speaking to me in Spanish, I would respond in Spanish. And so that translanguaging to me at such a young age is something that like kind of astonishes me. I'm like, wow, like, so I was smart, in my head, but because I was learning 2 languages simultaneously, I was, I think, maybe proficient in both during elementary, but I was not like excelling in one more than the other because I used both equally. And so I think that's why I wasn't doing as like high as my peers who were only learning in English and were able to express themselves more. So that's something that I learned and is very recent to me. Moving forward, I think the second part of the first questions asks about, or to talk about any like interpreting, translanguaging, or translating that happened. I know that I talked about this during my language map activity, I believe. I started preschool I started my 3rd year of preschool at 4 years old, and I had a friend. Her name was Haley, and she had just come from Sonora, Mexico, knowing not a lick of English. I was proficient in both. I believe this was new information to me, but I was proficient in both, and because I was able to understand and speak both, my preschool teacher asked me to translate for her. We didn't have any resources, anyone to come help her, so everything that came to me from the teacher, I had to like translate in my little 4-year-old brain and spit back to her in Spanish, and then vice versa. Anything I heard from her in Spanish, I had to translate and say to the teacher in English. And so that pressure for a 4-year-old, I think, is something insane. Like I've been doing it since I was little, and I think that was my first experience and introduction to teaching. I was teaching the teacher and teaching my friend like Spanish and English at the same time. And I guess now reflecting, that's where my spark or my calling to be a teacher started. I always say second grade because of another experience that I had, but we could say preschool now. But yeah, that was an experience that I had. Okay, so number 2 is, what language practices have you learned or acquired later in life? I think not feeling as guilty when I speak Spanglish has been something that I've gotten more okay with this year, specifically because of my CNI course and talking about how any Spanish is good Spanish, and whether that means you talk fluent, like completely start to finish in Spanish or start to finish in English, or if you mix and match words, that is okay. Like, that is a new language that we are co-constructing right now. Being able to understand both languages in like a sentence, and that's something that I felt very guilty about. I felt like I was a fake Spanish speaker most of my life because there were certain words that I didn't know in English, and I would say them in Spanish at school, or vice versa with speaking to my grandma. I'd be like, the onion, like, and then I would like, show so that they'd be able to comprehend, and I felt really guilty for that. But that's something that I have learned later in life, that it's okay. And that's something that I'm trying to project onto my students as well. Knowing any Spanish is better than knowing none. And I think this goes back to like abuelita epistemologies, like being able to use what our abuelitas taught us, and maybe we don't know exactly like los rezos fully in Spanish, and we can say them in Spanglish, and trying to teach them as well, and teach myself that it's okay to use both languages in a conversation. The last question kind of answered number 3, how have these language practices influence who you are and how you self-identify. I think I self-identify as neither American nor Mexican. I identify as Chicana. No soy ni de allá ni de acá. And so, woo. And I think that's something that I'm also trying to make more okay within the classroom, trying to bring in that like Chicano word, because growing up it was hard, like not knowing what I was and not feeling like I belonged to either or. So if I went through something similar, I feel like my students might be as well. So I want to voice that and let them know that Chicano is a term where any and all belong, but yeah, that's, I guess, how I self-identify. Number 4, how has your racialized identity influenced the ways that people perceive your language practices? This is interesting because today I had one of my students call me over, and he goes, Ms. Bree, how do you say this word in Spanish? And I was like, that's a good question. I don't know, but you should look it up. And he goes, Miss Bree, aren't you supposed to be the Spanish teacher? Like, aren't you supposed to know this? And in my head, I was like, I am the Spanish teacher. Like, I should know this. But that was an awesome teaching moment for me to be like, I'm a teacher, but I'm also a student. Like, I'm a lifelong student. I'm always going to be learning. I'm not going to know all the words. Like, I'm human. We make mistakes. Let's look it up together. And so we did, and we figured it out. But that kind of stuck in my head, the identity that they see me as is like this Latina who is a Stanford student who should know like Spanish because she wants to be a Spanish teacher. Like, they see me as that, and that's I think also racialized identity, because of like how I look. They expect me to know all Spanish, and I'm like, just because I look like that doesn't mean but yeah. And so it's a learning journey where I'm getting to teach them that it's okay to not know everything. Like, I may be in grad school I may be teaching Spanish, but I don't know all the words. It's hard sometimes to translate like instantly, and so that's something that I'm hoping they are more like easygoing on with me, you know. Now, vice versa. How have your language practices influenced the way that people perceive you racially? If I'm being honest, I think I'm a little bit of a ditz when it comes to this. Like, I don't think I pay too much attention to this, which I should be paying a little bit more. But I think one way that they could be perceiving me racially is like, oh, she, like in Spanish speaking countries, if I go, they're like, oh, like she's a no sabo, you know, like se me oye un acento cuando hablo el español, and they're like, oh yeah, like estás pocha o estás gringa, or they'll be like, oh, like no eres de aquí, verdad? And I'm like, I speak Spanish, you know, but that's one way I could think of. And when I'm here, like people can tell that I learned it since I was young, but I'm not a native to any Spanish speaking country. And so they're like, well, you look Hispanic, but you don't sound Hispanic. So also the idea that I'm able to, you know, that I speak both languages within a conversation could also like throw them off a little. But nothing has been specifically like said to me like derogatory about like what my language practices are and how that influences like what they think of me racially much. Yeah. So the next question, number 6, how have your experiences with language and race afforded you certain privileges and or obstructed access to certain privileges? I am very oblivious. I think this is something that took me some time to think about. I think it has opened many doors for me, but most of it is attributed to the fact that I can communicate in 2 languages. Getting hired for this specific job, I remember they were looking for someone who could speak in both languages. It was an educational preparation program, and I was working with them, and we were giving CPR classes to underprivileged middle school students who were interested in learning more about like CPR and first aid, and they were interested in the medical field, so I wanted to give them a taste of that. And so I was assisting and giving a class because I was just there like helping out. And they started looking for someone who could speak Spanish because the instructor did not know Spanish, and they were planning on giving a class to parents, and I did not feel qualified at all. But because I spoke Spanish and he didn't, they asked me to lead the class to the parents and teach them first aid and CPR at a level of Spanish that was adequate for them to understand, because this medical terminology, you know, sometimes can be a little confusing. And so I had to do a lot of like work to know the terminology first and then translate it to Spanish because it was in English. So I translated it to Spanish, and then from that I had to translate it to like more colloquial Spanish, something that they could understand, terms that they could understand. So it was like a lot that I had to do on my end, but I felt very satisfied because I had the opportunity to teach them, and they were very grateful that I was there and they were able to understand everything that I said. So that's something that I feel privileged to say that I had the opportunity to do. As for obstructed access to certain privileges, I don't think I've had many. You know, growing up in LA, like it's Latino Central, everyone there for the most part speaks more than one language, and so knowing more than one language is extremely valuable, and most jobs see that. And want that, and so there hasn't been an opportunity that's like been obstructed because I speak two languages, which I'm very happy and I hope I don't ever encounter. Number 7 asks, how have your experiences with language and race shaped your educational experiences and career trajectories? So for undergrad, I went to UCLA. This school is claimed to be very diverse, but all my Spanish classes, I was always one of 4 students that were darker skinned. Everyone else was very white. And ooh, my goodness. I remember this one specific professor, very light skinned as well. I think Argentinian, and he never ever called on any of the darker skinned students like myself and 2 others students that I was friends with. We always sat together because we didn't feel comfortable in that classroom, and he never called on us. Our hands would always be raised. We'd be trying to engage with conversation, never even looked our way, and he would only ever call on students that were lighter skinned, and that's something that really took a toll on me and allowed me to see that racism does exist. And it was sad to think about, and I think that's why I hated that class so much. I hated having to go because I did not feel comfortable. I did not feel empowered by him whatsoever, and it was an unfortunate circumstance, but a very real one. And I know that that probably happens in other classrooms as well. But during that time, thankfully, I was working as a TA for an elementary school in Bel Air, which is another very, very white population. I had one Latino student in my classroom. Everyone else was white or Asian. I think I had like 3 Asian students and everyone else was white. And although that was that situation, I had a very supportive lead teacher that was teaching that class, and she gave me the opportunity and the platform to engage with the students and teach them about cultural games in Mexico, which is where I'm from. I brought them back some toys and I taught them how to use them, what they meant, why they were so colorful. And then later on in that year, I got to teach lessons, which I think is a huge opportunity that I got. I got to teach them lessons on Spanish, and they were just so engaged and wanting to know more. And they would see me and they'd be like, Breanna, they called me Breanna. They'd be like, Breanna, like, is this color rojo? And I was like, yes, like, or they'd be like, buenos dias. And then I was like, oh, like they actually like this and they're engaged with me. And so that part of them made me feel comfortable and so proud as well. So it was definitely a career trajectory where I experienced language and race, but in a very positive way. I don't think I've ever thought about language and race as much as I have right now, and I'm realizing that all of these experiences that I hold in my chest, whether positive or negative, have to do with language and race and how they affect me as a person, as well, like both negative and positive. But the next question asks, how have these experiences that you've described above informed the ways that you think about language and race today? And so now that I'm sitting here and thinking about it today, I feel very fortunate that I've had the experiences that I've had because they have made me who I am today. I'm excited to continue learning. I'm excited to share these experiences with everyone and to be able to build on them and, just create more experiences revolved around language and race, and hopefully make a positive impact in the people around me and my students primarily. This next question is awesome. It says, how have these experiences prepared you to make sense of your future students and their language practices? I think that it has taught me to give them grace. You know, I don't push them. If I can tell or I can feel that they feel hesitant to speak, I won't push them to speak out loud in like big groups. I set little plans with them, like, okay, you don't want to present today, that's totally okay. You don't feel comfortable with it, okay, you can do this instead. But next class, do you think we can present maybe just with you and me? Okay, yeah. And so then they're growing in that sense where I'm teaching through grace. I am giving them that sense of, I guess, vulnerability, that I'm being vulnerable with them. I know what they might be going through because I witnessed it in myself, or I witnessed it in peers while I was in school, and I don't want to make them uncomfortable. That's the last thing I want to do in this classroom. And so setting up those plans kind of helps them check in with themselves. Okay, I don't have to present today, but there is a timeline, you know. I'm going to grow as a person and we're going to get there. And one thing that I also say almost every single day is any Spanish is good. Spanish. Mix in half of it English, okay, that's okay. Mix in 25% English, awesome. We will get there at one point, but everyone is on their own language journey. I'm just the one here aiding each and every single one of them to get to a level like higher, wherever they are on their journey. I just want to help you get to another point, you know? And so letting them know that kind of helps them feel more comfortable. You know, the expectation isn't that you have to be perfect and you have to know Spanish 100%, or you have to do 100% on like a test. It's, can you do your best? And it's, I am expecting the best from you, but whatever you turn in at the end of the day is what is your best for you, and that's okay too, you know. And also giving them or letting them know that having off days is okay too, but you know, come talk to me, you're having an off day, I'm so sorry about that, what can I do to help you? And so I think keeping that in mind is something that will help my future students and my current students that I have right now. As an anti-racist teacher, something that I could do to prepare to work with racialized students is keeping in mind the classroom ambiance and creating a safe space where all feel welcomed and feel comfortable speaking the language, whichever language, whether it's English or Spanish, or they're called dialects, but I also think that they're just languages. Any other language found in like a Latin American country would be awesome as well. Just letting them know that it's okay and to not feel like they have to be a certain way to fit into my future classroom. The last question is, what taken for granted assumptions about language and race might you need to interrogate? I think what I've been talking about this entire video, you know, just the fact that sometimes when thinking of a Spanish class, you think, oh, it has to be 100% in Spanish. Like, we're only talking this certain Spanish, and if you don't, then you are wrong and you're going to fail. Like, that's something that I need to interrogate, you know? Because I had a teacher today come into my classroom and he was like, oh, I have to speak Spanish, no puedes hablar inglés, like, and I was like, no, it's not, you know. I don't want my students thinking that like they can speak how they want to speak, and that's okay too. And that just also leads me to teaching through grace, what I've been talking about, having an open mind and an open heart, and letting my students know that. And so far I've been doing that this school year and it's worked out great. They feel comfortable talking to me in both languages. If I ask them to speak Spanish, they're comfortable with that. If I ask them to, or if they are speaking English, they're comfortable with that too. And that's something that I want to continue projecting into my future classrooms. But yeah, open mind, open heart.